Greetings, fellow empirical political inquiry students. My presentation is titled Social Media Audience Costs, and it is in response to the literature surrounding audience cost, which is an idea that states that leaders will incur a political penalty if they make a threat or a promise and then fail to follow through with it. Basically, the idea is that people want leaders who actually do what they say they're going to do, and leaders recognize this and think to themselves, hey, I better make agreements and promises and threats that I'm likely to follow through with so that people don't look at my track record and think that, oh, I can't be a reliable leader or a reliable ally. And a lot of these mechanisms have to do with what the leaders perceive their perception to be in the eyes of their, domestic audience, so the people who elect them or the people who might overthrow them if they get angry enough. And there are many of these studies in this literature that question whether democracies are actually super reliable allies, because when we think about countries you would like to live in nowadays, or countries that you think are reliable allies, you probably would think of a lot more democracies than you would authoritarian states. And so what a lot of the literature aims to explore is whether there are patterns how democracies act. And the idea is that democracies would act in accordance with the audience cost theory more than authoritarian states because, hey, democracy, if you are a leader, you have to be elected or you have to be re-elected. So that's why authoritarian states are hypothesized to be less affected by audience cost because, hey, they don't have to be elected. And so the gap in the literature comes from the rise of new technology, which in this case is focusing on social media. And I think this is an interesting gap because as time goes on, you will get technology, and especially with information technology, the spread of information will likely change how people interact with each other and perceive each other and deal with the world, especially with politics, and especially when you are concerned about how your audience is perceiving you, your domestic audience who's going to decide whether or not to re-elect you. So this gap leads to the research question, how does social media influence the foreign policy decisions of world leaders? So the hypothesis is if a world leader has a large social media following with which they frequently engage, then they will be more likely to favor international agreements that include obligations that are easy to fulfill or require little intervention. So according to the literature, especially the meta-analysis by Chiba, Johnson, and Leeds, there is this idea that will be certain treaties and alliances and agreements that are favored by democracies because they don't really ask states to do much. So the methodology of this research design would be to examine trends in foreign policy portfolios between 1815 and 2018. 1815 being the earliest date examined in extant literature, and 2018 being where a lot of the available data is cut off, where there's not a lot of available data for 2019 quite yet. So data will be analyzed for trends and patterns occurring prior to and after 2006, because that is when Twitter was launched. So based on the aforementioned hypothesis, it is expected to find noticeable shifts in foreign policy trends during periods of time when a country's leader has a large social media presence. So you might be thinking, why would you be looking super far back in time when no leaders in the 19th century had Twitter? Well, that would mean that their social media presence would be zero. And then after 2006, you would expect to see trends, you'd expect to see changes. So the sample size is pretty interesting. There have been 168 UN member states that have been led by an individual who has maintained a Twitter account, or there is an official Twitter account of their office, whether they're the president or the prime minister or a monarch. So with the 168 UN member states plus the Vatican City and Taiwan, that gives a sample size of 170 different states to pull data from. And I think in my research design, that number was a little bit higher, but I recounted. Yes, I counted all of this. I looked up every single leader to see if they had a Twitter account. And surprisingly, there were a lot who did, which just goes to show how important social media has become. So how do you operationalize social media presence? Well, that would be done by taking the product of a leader's audience size and the frequency of engagement per given year. The audience size would be the mean or average number of Twitter followers per given year, and the frequency of engagement would be the number of Twitter posts per given year. And so, for example, President Donald Trump for 2017 would have a social media presence score of about 34 billion due to having sent 2,400 tweets in 2017 to an average audience of over 31 million followers. Another important concept to operationalize in code would be the level of formality and rigidity of the obligations of foreign policy agreements. And this is an ordinal scale that is not identical to, but similar to and inspired by the ordinal scale used by Signorio and Ritter in their research. And so it grades different types of agreements on the formality and how entangled the state is to perform a certain action. And assuming that patterns predicted by the hypothesis are discovered, one can then decide to apply the variable of democracy, how democratic a state is, and that can be pulled from Polity 4 scores, which has a large data set from 1815 all the way to now, and that has been used by most of the studies in the literature